But as he scrubbed the audio, he noticed something in the waveform. Elias Thorne was a man who dealt in recovered silences. As a professional acoustic restorer, his job was to clean up old recordings, degraded magnetic tapes, wax cylinders, and wire recordings, removing the hiss of time to reveal the voices beneath. When the estate of Dr. Aris Thorne, no relation, or so the lawyers claimed, hired him to catalogue a vault of reel-to-reel tapes found in a collapsed basement in rural Vermont, Elias expected dust. He didn't expect the rhythm. The setup. The workspace was a lonely cabin 3 miles from the nearest paved road. It was 2026, yet the cabin felt stuck in 1954. Elias set up his digital interface alongside a refurbished Nagra tape deck. The first 100 tapes were mundane, Dr. Thorne's clinical observations on subsonic psychological entrainment. On his monitor, the audio software displayed the sound as a visual wave. Standard background noise looks like jagged grass. This was different. Underneath the doctor's voice, there was a perfectly geometric pattern. It wasn't random. It looked like a series of repeating, interlocking teeth. Elias frowned. Natural interference doesn't create perfect squares in a frequency range of 7 Hz to 12 Hz. He isolated the track and boosted the volume. Silence. At least his ears heard silence. But the woofers on his studio monitors began to vibrate. A glass of water on the desk developed a series of concentric rings, cymatics. The water was reacting to a sound he couldn't perceive. The first manifestation. That night, the watched wait arrived. Elias was in bed when he felt it, a subtle thrumming in his pillow. It felt like a massive engine was idling miles underground. He sat up, his heart hammering against his ribs in a syncopated rhythm that matched the vibration. He looked toward the corner of the room. The shadows there seemed thicker, not darker but more substantial, as if the air had gained mass. He reached for the lamp, but his hand froze. From the hallway he heard it. It wasn't a footstep. It was a sound he had just spent 6 hours cleaning. Click, whir, static. It was the sound of a tape recorder starting up. Elias crept into the workspace. The Nagra deck was spinning. The record button was depressed, the red light glowing like a malevolent eye in the dark. "I didn't turn that on," he whispered. He hit stop and rewind. The tape squealed as it zipped back. He hit play. For the first 30 seconds, there was only the ambient sound of the room, the wind against the cabin, his own distant snoring from the bedroom. Then, a voice. It wasn't Dr. Thorne. It was Elias's own voice, but it sounded hollow, as if the words were being spoken into a long metallic pipe. "It's in the frequencies, Elias. You're letting it in. Every time you clean the tape, you're sharpening the blade." Elias backed away, tripping over a stack of tape canisters. He scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the monitor. The software was still open. The waveform of the recording he just made wasn't a wave at all. It was a map. The peaks and valleys of the audio formed a perfect topographical outline of the woods surrounding the cabin, with a pulsing red dot centered exactly where he was standing. "Resonate!" the silence screamed. "There are things in the universe that have no physical form, entities of pure vibration. They cannot enter our world because they have no shape. But if you create the right frequency, if you carve a hole in the silence using specific decibel levels and hertz, you provide them with a bridge." Elias hadn't been cleaning the tapes. He had been tuning the doorway. Suddenly the cabin lights flickered and died. The hum returned, louder now, vibrating the floorboards until Elias's teeth ached. The watched wait was no longer in the corner. It was right behind him. He could feel the displacement of air, the cold pressure of something that wasn't there, yet vibrated with an intense, furious life. He reached for his flashlight, but the beam cut through the dark only to reveal that the walls of the cabin were no longer wood. They were vibrating so fast they had become translucent. He could see the trees outside, swaying in a wind he couldn't hear. The sensation wasn't pain, not yet. It was an invasive structural wrongness. Have you ever stood too close to a massive subwoofer at a concert, where the bass feels like it's rearranging your internal organs? This was that, but sharpened to a needlepoint. Elias gripped the edge of his mahogany desk. Under his palms, the wood felt like liquid. The high-frequency shriek, the one that had screamed "resonate," had settled into a rhythmic pulsing. Thump hiss, thump hiss. It was the sound of a heart, but not a human heart. It was too slow, each beat separated by several seconds of agonizing, pressurized silence. The archive of the lost. Elias fumbled for his backup lantern. The battery-powered LED flickered to life, casting a cold blue light across the room. He needed to find the end of Dr. Thorne's research. He needed to know if the doctor had found a way to detune the room. He lunged for the vault crates, the ones marked restricted, biological acoustic impact. He tore through the folders until he found a series of Polaroids taped to a legal pad. The photos didn't show ghosts or monsters. They showed people. In the first photo, a young lab assistant sat in a chair. In the second, taken perhaps an hour later, the assistant's features looked blurred. Not a camera motion blur, but as if his skin were losing its grip on his muscles. By the fourth photo, the man was a smear of organic static, a smudge of pink and grey vibration caught in a seated position. A handwritten note from Dr. Thorne fell from the folder. The threshold of the third state is reached at exactly 11.2 Hz at 140 decibels. At this resonance, the atomic bonds of carbon-based life begin to lose their certainty. We are not being eaten. We are being unmade so that we may be used as a medium for the broadcast. Elias looked at his hands. His fingernails were vibrating so fast they appeared to be transparent. A low mist was rising from his skin. It was steam. The friction of his own molecules rubbing against one another was generating heat. He realized then that the broadcast didn't want him dead. It wanted him to be the antenna. In the corner of the workspace, a heavy iron ring bolt set into the floor began to rattle. This was the entrance to the lower cellar, the place where the tapes had been found. Dr. Thorne's notes mentioned the source. The doctor believed the cabin was built over a geological anomaly, a hollow pocket of quartz and magnetite that acted as a natural amplifier for the Earth's infrasonic hum. The rattle of the iron ring became a roar. The floorboards around it began to splinter, not breaking, but disintegrating into fine sawdust. Something was coming up. Elias tried to run for the front door, but his legs wouldn't obey. The resonance had synchronized with his nervous system. Every time the pulse hit, thump hiss, his muscles locked in a tetanic seizure. He was a puppet being jerked toward the cellar door by a string made of sound. He hit the floor, his chin cracking against the wood. He crawled, his fingers digging into the gaps between the planks. He looked down into the cellar as the hatch finally shattered. Below wasn't a room. It was a throat. The basement had been lined with thousands of miles of magnetic tape, draped from the ceiling like willow branches. They moved in an invisible wind, swaying in perfect unison. And in the center of the room sat Dr. Aris Thorne, or what was left of him. The doctor was fused to a chair made of rusted iron and copper wire. His body had been stretched. His limbs were thin, translucent ribbons of flesh that reached out to touch the walls. His head was tilted back, his mouth locked in a wide circular O. He was no longer a man. He was a tuning fork. As the pulse hit, Thorne's body vibrated with such intensity that he turned into a flash of white light. The sound that erupted from his open mouth was a perfect, pure tone that shattered every window in the cabin simultaneously. Elias felt his own skin begin to drift. The edges of his vision were fraying into geometric patterns. He realized that if he didn't break the loop, he would be pulled down into that chair, his molecules stretched and tuned until he was just another layer of the broadcast. He looked at his digital interface, still miraculously powered by its internal battery. The waveform of the source was peaking. He had one chance. In audio engineering, you can cancel a sound by playing its exact opposite, a phase-inverted signal. 180 degrees out of phase. If he could record the source, invert the wave and play it back through his high-output studio monitors, he might be able to create a pocket of absolute silence. He reached for the mouse, his hand shaking so violently he could barely see it. He hit record. The source roared. The doctor's translucent body in the basement began to rise, hovering in the center of the magnetic tape forest. Elias's screen flickered. The waveform appeared, a jagged, terrifying mountain range of black lines. He highlighted the track. His finger hovered over the invert command. But the voice, the one inside his chest, laughed. It was a sound like grinding stones. You think silence is safety, Elias? Silence is where we live. We are the gap between the notes. The cursor was a ghost. Elias watched as his own hand, now shimmering with a translucent oily sheen, struggled to maintain its physical density. He wasn't just losing his grip on the mouse, he was losing his grip on the concept of a hand. "Focus," he hissed, the word coming out as a distorted metallic rasp. He clicked. The software processed the request. On the screen, the jagged waveform flipped vertically. The peaks became valleys, the valleys became peaks. He had created the antithesis. Elias slammed the spacebar to play. The result was instantaneous and violent. It wasn't a sound, but a void. When the inverted wave hit the air, it collided with the source in a mathematical suicide. The two frequencies, being perfectly opposite, cancelled each other out to a value of 0 decibels. The roar stopped. The vibrating walls of the cabin snapped back into solid wood with the force of a thunderclap. The translucent doctor in the basement let out a soundless scream as his form collapsed, his molecular integrity failing without the frequency to hold his distorted shape. For a moment there was a peace so profound it felt like being underwater. Elias slumped against the desk, his skin regaining its opacity. His heart slowed. The watched weight lifted. But as he sat in the absolute stillness, he noticed something terrifying. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was an active, sucking vacuum. The silence was heavy. In the world of acoustics, true silence is impossible. There is always the rush of blood in the ears, the hum of the nervous system. But this was a mathematical vacuum. Elias looked at his monitors. The level meters were frozen at negative infinity. Then he saw it. In the centre of the room, where the two sounds had cancelled each other out, a thin vertical line of nothing appeared. It looked like a crack in a mirror, but instead of showing what was behind it, it showed a static-filled grey void. Something was pushing through the crack. It didn't use sound. It used the absence of it. A cold grey hand, fingers too long, joints bending in directions that defied Euclidean geometry, wrapped around the edge of the silence. "The inversion doesn't close the door, Elias," a voice whispered. It didn't come from his chest this time. It didn't come from the speakers. It came from the crack. "It just clears the air so we can see you better." The cabin began to groan, but not from vibration. It was being pulled inward, toward the crack. The desk, the tapes, the Nagra deck, all of it began to stretch like taffy, being sucked into the 0 decibel vacuum. Elias realized his mistake. By creating a zone of perfect cancellation, he had created a path of least resistance. He hadn't built a wall. He had built a vacuum tube. He scrambled toward the door, but the floor was tilting. The basement hatch was gone, replaced by a swirling vortex of magnetic tape and grey light. He saw the remains of Dr. Thorne, a skeletal husk, being whipped around the room like a dead leaf in a cyclone. Elias grabbed a handheld digital recorder from his pocket. He had one last desperate idea. If the inversion created a vacuum, he needed to break the phase. He needed noise. Random, chaotic, untunable noise. He didn't look for a frequency. He looked for a physical impact. He smashed the recorder against the edge of the desk, shattering the casing but keeping the internal mic live. He screamed into it, not a note, but a raw, guttural howl of pure human terror. He set the device to loop and threw it directly into the crack. The hand recoiled. The chaotic, non-repeating frequency of a human scream was like acid to a creature made of perfect geometry. The crack began to ripple. The grey void turned a sickly violet. Elias didn't wait to see if it worked. He threw himself through the shattered window, glass tearing at his arms, and tumbled into the wet dirt of the Vermont woods. He didn't stop running until the cabin was a mile behind him. When he finally looked back, there was no cabin. There was only a perfectly circular clearing in the trees. The grass was white, turned to ash by the sheer intensity of the resonance. No birds sang. No insects chirped. Part 4. The Echo in the Blood. The conclusion. Elias Thorne survived, but the story didn't end in the woods. Weeks later, in his city apartment, Elias sat in a soundproofed room. He no longer worked as an acoustic restorer. He couldn't stand the sound of a humming refrigerator or the whistle of a tea kettle. He lived in a world of earplugs and heavy curtains. But one night, as he lay in the dark, he felt a familiar thrumming in his pillow. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from his own bones. He had been tuned too long. The frequency was part of his DNA now. He picked up a glass of water from his nightstand. In the dim light he saw them. The concentric rings. The water was reacting to him. Elias Thorne was no longer a man. He was the recording. And somewhere in the grey void, something was hitting play.